Dad had rented a large house at number 92 Nueva de Leon in a comfortable section of Santiago, across the street from the Uruguayan embassy and 2 doors down from the Yugoslav embassy. The house was so big and exotic looking that when I walked through it for the first time, I didn't think it could possibly belong just to us. "Who lives up here?" I asked Mom as we climbed up to the 3rd floor. I'd been reading George MacDonald's The Princess and the Goblin, and I remembered how Princess Irene climbed up to the 3rd floor of her castle and found a great-great-grandmother she never knew she had. I didn't expect to find long-lost relatives lurking on the top floor of our new house, but I thought there might be other families living up there. The house came complete with housekeeper, laundress, a twice-a-week gardener, and an unfortunate infestation. In an early letter to her sister, Mom wrote that we were living in decaying elegance, with a chandelier in every bedroom and fleas in every bed.
Oh my God. My sister reminded me that I wrote that to her. I had forgotten about why they had fleas. Well, one reason, the house we lived in was like, what did they build? Adobe. It was a big house, but it was adobe, and it just had thin layers of plaster over it. So when there was that earthquake and the walls, you'd see all these cracks in the walls, then you could see the adobe. And so all that dirt, of course fleas would flourish in a place, that type of thing.
Yeah.
Isabel was our housekeeper and took care of the main cooking and cleaning. At first, Dad had to do all the communicating with her because no one else spoke Spanish. When Dad wasn't around, Isabel and Mom had some interesting conversations, Mom with dictionary in hand, and Isabel with a patient, albeit confused, look on her face. Isabel often says, "Ya, señora," when I ask her to do something, Mom commented one day. "I think ya must mean that she already did it," she decided, consulting the dictionary. I thought ya meant ya, which we children used a lot and were instructed to say yes instead. Aurora came in weekly to do the laundry, although Mom operated the washing machine that had traveled with us on the Santa Isabel. Eduardo was the gardener, and he came with the house. Rory would occasionally take a stick and go out and poke around in the gardens and announce that he was helping Eduardo. Isabel sometimes brought in her sister Maria to help out with various tasks around the house, and her daughter Maria Inez helped out with sewing and mending. The owners had listed the house with the United States Embassy, thinking no doubt that an American family accustomed to the finer things would be suitable tenants. I don't know just what they thought of the 8 of us, but it's safe to assume they feared for the future of their house. Whenever there was an earthquake severe enough to loosen plaster and crack walls, Mom would have us sweep the debris into a corner and leave it there until Doña Yoli had seen it. She didn't want her children being blamed for any natural disasters. With 5 bedrooms, there was plenty of room for us as well as for the volunteers who stayed there when they were visiting from the provinces or convalescing after appendectomies. The Peace Corps had sent 4 trunks full of books to be distributed to the volunteers, and those that were not selected wound up at the Casa Judge Lending Library, where our guests enjoyed everything from Zane Grey to Mickey Spillane. We had arrived in Chile on December 5th, 2 weeks before the school ended for the year, and 16 days before the beginning of summer, a seasonal switch that was a bit hard for me to figure out. We celebrated our first tropical Christmas a few weeks later, and met many of the volunteers when they came to our house on Christmas Eve for cocktails, lasagna, and chicken. We decorated one of the evergreen trees in the front yard and gathered around it to sing Christmas carols in the balmy air. At first, I didn't know exactly what we were doing there in Chile, nor did I have a firm grasp on just what the Peace Corps was all about. I knew it consisted of a large group of friendly people who spoke Spanish badly, came to our house for parties, and sang a funny song which went, "Would you like to join me?" Oh, we ain't got a barrel of money. Maybe we're ragged and funny, but we'll travel along, singing a song, side by side. I actually used to think that was the official Peace Corps song. I think it was the unofficial Peace Corps song. In Chile, the Peace Corps worked under the auspices of Techo, an organization founded by, among others, an Argentinian Jesuit, Father Alejandro del Coro. Techo, the Spanish word for roof, sought to improve the lives of the marginalized workers in the country by empowering them to make decisions about their employment and by giving them access to the means of production. Dad met the board of Techo shortly after he arrived. It was made up of a group of professionals, a banker, an architect, and a politician, among others, and a group of what Dad came to call the mamacitas, the mothers, who had great energy and commitment but didn't always have the practical capabilities to make things happen. At that time, there were 5 different groups who wanted to control Techo, and Dad found himself invited to 5 different homes to eat dinner and hear this perspective of that board member as to why his or her faction should be in charge. The businessmen wanted Padre del Coro out as directors, but the mamacitas wanted him in, so he stayed. Notwithstanding all the differences of opinion, Dad and the board did manage to set up bases of operation throughout the country. 10 of the volunteers were assigned to 5 locations in the north and south of Chile, and the other 10 stayed in Santiago. The group was setting up productive cooperatives, and much of the work was done in the callampas. Callampa means mushroom, and these were the slums that had mushroomed on the outskirts of the city. At one point, in an attempt to deal with the homelessness and lack of adequate housing, the government had set up tiny council houses in these areas. But the houses and the surrounding areas were soon overrun by the homeless and destitute, who moved out there and squatted on the land, led, in some cases, by Father del Coro, who encouraged them to follow him to these areas. 4 big callampas in Santiago had a population of about 350,000 people, with many of them living in La Victoria, the biggest of the slums and the one we came to know best. Dad would occasionally take us out to La Victoria to meet the people he worked with. One Sunday, he took us there to Mass. They had no church, so the liturgy was celebrated in an old shack where they stored newspapers. "Daddy, it smells in here," Bridget complained. "Let's go home." "Don't you realize Jesus Christ was born in a place like this?" asked Dad. He always tried to turn everything into a learning experience. Eventually, I developed a slightly better understanding of the work the volunteers did, although we tended to know them better by their interactions with us. David and Leo worked with furniture and sewing cooperatives in Valdivia, but we knew them for the peanut butter they brought when they came to visit. Marcy and Nelson worked with the garbage and fishing cooperatives in Antofagasta, but we knew them for the books in English that Marcy's aunt had sent from her bookstore back at home. Tom handled the payroll for the cooperative workers in La Victoria, but is still remembered for the day he had to bring 4-year-old Rory home early from a trip to the zoo because Rory was being such a brat. Bobby was the public health nurse at La Victoria, but we knew her because she made house calls to give us shots. Jan did social work in the poblaciones, but her guitar playing during parties was what we enjoyed. Lee worked with the shoe cooperative, and Lucille set up the daycare center in La Victoria, but we remember them because they got married shortly after we arrived in Chile, shortly after they arrived and we arrived. Walt and Mike worked with a housing cooperative in Osorno.
Oh.
He had come to tell Dad that he planned to leave the Osorno project out of frustration with the lack of action by the locals. They got into a heated discussion, and when Dad told Walt that he couldn't quit his job, the house resounded with Walt's frustrated response. "Bullshit, Judge! I can quit if I want to." "If you quit, you'll be abandoning the poor," Dad told him. "And worse, you'll be abandoning yourself." Dad then launched into a long and complicated story about Lenin and Russia and not giving up, and eventually changing the course of history. Walt had no idea what he was talking about, nor any illusions about his own ability to change the course of history the way Lenin had. But by the time Dad finished his lecture, he decided to stick it out and returned to Osorno, fired up with ambition. The Peace Corps was frequently mentioned in El Siglo, the communist newspaper. Once they wrote an article about a group of U.S. academics who were surveying Chile to determine what resources were available for use in case of an invasion. Because of Dad's university affiliation, his name was mentioned in the article. His assistant was asked by a socialist friend, how could she work for an organization that sent volunteers to spy on her country? And how did he know they were spies? He'd just been in the south of Chile, where he noticed that Peace Corps volunteers spent many hours drinking and talking. He decided they were spies trying to gather sensitive information from Chileans. The fact that they tended to wear dark glasses probably strengthened this impression. Other volunteers made a very different impression. Ed and Jerry were assigned to Ancud in the south with barely any details of what they were to do. So for the first few weeks after they arrived, they'd be seen walking along a nearby beach or sitting quietly in the office, deeply engrossed in reading one of the Peace Corps issued paperbacks collected from the Casa Judge lending library. Because of their dark clothing and seemingly studious absorption in their reading material, they were thought to be recently arrived priests reading their missals.